Welcome to my presentation on the knowledge gap theory. We're going to talk about what exactly the theory is, how it's been studied over time, and how it can be further applied in the field of ag communications. So what is the theory? The knowledge gap hypothesis, that's the formal name, abbreviated as KGH, was formed in 1970 with this article by three authors from the University of Minnesota. Go Gophers. And so these three really were the forefathers of this new theory. The original hypothesis, as it was stated in that article, says that as the infusion of mass media information into a social system increases, segments of the population with higher socioeconomic status tend to acquire this information at a faster rate than the lower status segments, so that the gap in knowledge between these segments tends to increase rather than decrease. They wanted to clarify that it doesn't mean that people of lower status are going to become less informed over time. It doesn't mean that they're going to be completely uninformed. It just means that people of higher status are learning at a faster rate, and that's because of the mass media. And the authors based their original hypothesis off of 20 years of findings, some of them their own, some of them from other authors. And it was great because this new hypothesis explained all these things that had been found. The level of education had been strongly correlated with how much people knew about political affairs, or public affairs, political campaigns, science, including agriculture. And so more interest, more knowledge, more exposure, strongly correlated with the higher socioeconomic status. That made sense. The mass media, it didn't seem as it had been reaching the general public at all. So this kind of explained, maybe why it wasn't reaching the whole general public. I want to point out that originally this theory was only meant to explain print media because they weren't ready to make any major judgments about the effect of radio and television yet. That still hadn't been studied enough. And so this is a really good example, stating the belief that man will reach the moon by education. So as you can see, people of higher levels of education were more likely to believe that man would one day reach the moon than people of lower levels of education. And as you can see, over time, the gaps between these groups actually widened, and that's because people of higher education were learning more through the mass media. So I think this is a really good picture to explain what exactly we mean by knowledge gaps and knowledge gaps widening, and why that might be a concern. The knowledge gap hypothesis was based on five factors that the authors thought were attributed to the different socioeconomic statuses. And so these were communication skills, stored information, relevant social contact, who people were interacting with, selective exposure, acceptance, retention, and the nature of the system as a whole. So some key questions that come to mind: do these factors change over time? Is this an exhaustive list, or are there other things that affect the knowledge gap? Are these factors specific only to Western culture? Researchers presented conflicting factors right away within the first 5 years. So this hypothesis, as it was originally stated, has definitely been challenged, but it really set forth a new way of studying a lot of issues. So it was a really good start. So here's the timeline. And this timeline really shows that there's been supportive findings, there's been conflicting findings, there's been refinement. New disciplines have started to use this hypothesis. And this is only just a snapshot of a few of the really big studies that have gone on, and I'll just touch on a few of them. But there's been a lot of use of this theory and a lot of interesting changes in its structure. So as I stated earlier, it started in 1970 when the theory was formally established, but the authors made modifications right away in other studies they came up with. They wanted to point out that smaller communities, even though they might be less informed about national news, they could still be really informed about local news. And in their 1975 study, they came up with four major modifications that they wanted to add to kind of qualify what they had said. And they said that if a whole community was affected, if there was a climate of social conflict, if the community was really small and homogeneous rather than being really diverse, if these three were in place, it was more likely that the entire community could actually be informed about a particular issue, regardless of their socioeconomic statuses. And a fourth thing that they wanted to point out was that gaps could actually decline over time as attention decreased to a particular issue. So if an issue wasn't being discussed in the mass media as much as it had been before, the knowledge gap for that particular issue could decrease. So that's kind of a key point in this study, is that it looks at specific issues rather than knowledge as a whole. So there was more conflicting findings, more new considerations to think about that came about, and I'll just point out a few. Interesting and usefulness, what was their effect? Were those directly tied to socioeconomic statuses? Because people are more likely to follow a story if they're interested, or if they think that information is going to be useful to them. And that ties in directly with motivation. And this study here showed that motivation rather than education had a real direct effect on the knowledge that was being gained in that study. Another study here, they looked at motivation again, and they said motivation was the reason why the theory was proven wrong in this case. They did an information campaign, and it actually eliminated the knowledge gaps of people's cardiovascular health knowledge. And they kind of assumed that this is because people were really motivated to learn about this particular subject. So it was one of the examples of how this theory was conflicted with findings afterwards. So I want to mention again that they're still mostly looking at print media at this point in time, looking at newspaper circulation and the effects of that. There's research being done about radio and TV, but it wasn't quite lining up with the results they've been finding about print media, and so there still wasn't a whole lot of major conclusions drawn on the role of radio and print media. In 1999, there was a study that really focused on motivation, and it looked at the knowledge gap hypothesis and how it had been studied in the years from 1970 to 1999, and it said that 3 different models had been used. And the first one, the earliest model, was the causal association model, and that means that motivational variables are caused by socioeconomic status, so motivation didn't need to be looked at separately. Second model was the rival explanation model, and so that said that education and motivational factors actually compete against one another to have an effect on whether or not people will gain knowledge. Now, a third model, this is the one that was suggested in this theory as the way that the field should continue to go towards, and to further test this theory because it made the most sense. So this motivational contingency model said that high motivation variables can lessen the effect of education-based knowledge gaps. So this was a really key study here in 1999. Now in 2000, things changed quite a bit because Stanford came up with a study looking at the internet use and how it had been changing the way Americans were doing everything. And so this study was also important to the knowledge gap hypothesis because it pointed out what they had found in the study was once people were connected to the net, they hardly differ in how much they use it and what they use it for. Pretty much for the most part, there's a little drop off with older people and gender gap, but for the most part, once people have access to the internet, they're using it the same way, the same amount. So that kind of played a role in looking at, well, if everyone's using the internet the same way, they're going to be gaining knowledge the same way from the internet, or at least that could be one idea that you could draw from this study. And something else to point out from the study, it pointed out that people were abandoning traditional mass media. They were deserting the media to use the internet. And so it was really more prevalent in television. People were spending less time watching television, more time on the internet. And it also was happening with newspapers as well. So that really brought attention to the internet, and we needed to study this further in relation to the knowledge gap. Okay, now the Swiss also did a study 2 years later about internet use, and their study brought up some key social issues for them, because they found that the educational gap in the internet access was actually widening from 97 to 2000. So people of different levels of education were having differences in whether or not they had access to the internet. And this is even more of a concern with the second finding that they came across. This finding here conflicts with the Standford study because it says people of higher education use the internet as a tool and people of lower education use it more for entertainment. So this kind of concerns people that, people of higher education are going to continue to gain knowledge from the internet because they're using it as a tool. People of lower education aren't really using it to gain knowledge as much. They're using it for entertainment. So this conflicted with the Standford study, and it showed that, we really need to continue to look further at internet use, and maybe we had been wrong with our American study, or maybe it really was a difference in culture. I wanted to point out some key terms that came across, and this one was digital divide. It means that some people are accessing the internet, others aren't accessing the internet. So it became a new area of study, and one of the ways of studying it was using the knowledge gap hypothesis. Community boundness is a term that's used to, it's a way of measuring how a particular issue affects members of a community. So kind of related to the study we talked about before, or the findings we talked about before. And in this particular study here, people of lower socioeconomic status actually had a higher knowledge of medical assistance programs because that was something that was important to them. So community boundness kind of showed up as another variable to consider when looking at the knowledge gap hypothesis. So new variables were always arriving in the field. There's need for cognition, increased media choices. If people have a choice in what media they get to use, is that going to affect the knowledge gap? And then new disciplines have continued to join. Formal education. So this one's really interesting. When students come into a classroom, they come in with different levels of education, and does that play a role in their continued knowledge growth? And so this study, it showed some conflicting results. Sometimes it proved the knowledge gap theory to be true, sometimes it proved to be not true, but it brought up that if we are going to use the theory to look at formal education, we need to think about the intention of education, so why people are seeking an education, and we also need to consider different knowledge types. But I thought that was an interesting study there. So it's been used in a whole variety of applications and test. It's been tested in a lot of different ways. Looking at print versus TV news, wider gaps have been associated with print because people of lower socioeconomic status, they also use TV, and sometimes they do gain knowledge from that. But that's something that's been challenged in different studies, have shown different things. But in this particular study, it showed that wider gaps were associated with print rather than other forms of media, but mostly focused on television. Okay, so more studies, more support, new variables coming into play. There's lots and lots of interesting stuff, but I'm not going to go into all of it. So we'll skip over some really interesting findings that I just enjoyed learning about. And we'll go to the most recent research and what's been going on in 2013 related to this theory. And so mass media coverage related to HIV and AIDS in Ethiopia widened the knowledge gap between rural and urban people. So this proved the theory to be right in a certain issue here with HIV and AIDS. Now this one I think is really interesting here. This is a study that was done in China, and it was looking actually at smartphones, and it was urban students update their knowledge, get wider knowledge, and have greater depth of knowledge, which was really interesting because the rural students in this study, they also had access to smartphones, but they were using it differently than the urban students. And in another study, it said that device type can influence capital enhancing, which is another term that's been used, and capital enhancing means using a source to learn about political affairs. And so it was interesting that, if someone's using a mobile device rather than a PC, that could really have an effect on what they're actually learning from it. And so one other thing I wanted to point out, increased science, internet, and television use among lower education groups can help narrow the gap. So if we have information that's being used by lower education groups through internet and television, if they have that information, if they're using it, it will help them gain knowledge. So this kind of places importance on putting science out there that way on the internet and in TV. And this could definitely apply to increasing agricultural knowledge potentially, because it is a science type knowledge. So, so just some interesting studies that have been going on recently. So that's a brief overview of the timeline for everything that's been going on with the knowledge gap theory since 1970 to 2013. So now we'll look at the field of agri-communications and how it relates to the hypothesis. So as we saw in the timeline, it's been used in politics, health, crisis communication. I didn't get to that one, but that one's interesting. Education, and it's been used in science, and it's been used in agriculture specifically. And in fact, it's been used to bring new knowledge to farmers, or to study how new knowledge gets to farmers or doesn't. And in fact, before the theory was even started, in 1963, there was a study that noted that barely literate farmers in developing nations are often relatively farther behind in farming knowledge than were their illiterate grandparents. And so what that meant was that some farmers were learning more about farming, and there was new technologies out there, but if certain farmers, even though they could read, they weren't getting that information through the mass media. And also in 86, agricultural diffusion efforts were one of the main areas that was being examined, looking at the knowledge gap hypothesis. So whether farmers were getting new information about how to farm, how to improve practices. But recently, the US studies, they haven't been directly applying this hypothesis in the same way. But other studies in other countries are still using the knowledge gap hypothesis, mostly in developing countries. So, so that's one way that we have used this theory in agriculture, but maybe it's not really that necessary in United States agriculture anymore. As long as farmers actually are getting the knowledge that they need. However, I see this area as a way that we can really benefit from using the knowledge gap hypothesis in ag communications. So bringing farm knowledge to the general public. So some questions that maybe we could answer related to this hypothesis. So how does agriculture appear in the mass media? How often? What mediums are being used? So that would be a starting point. Also, do education levels and socioeconomic status play a role in agriculture knowledge from the mass media? So that's something that I think could really be answered and have a benefit to ag communications. What source, or does the source impact knowledge gaps? So, for example, if someone's learning about an agriculture issue from a general mass media publication rather than like an ag specific publication, does that influence how people gain knowledge, or what types of people gain knowledge? And also looking at the medium, do people learn about agriculture from TV, from the internet? Do they learn about it through the radio? Just looking at at the way people gain knowledge, and also considering different socioeconomic statuses, different backgrounds, rural and urban. Yeah, there's just a lot of ways that we can apply this theory in our field. And agriculture literacy is really what I'm thinking we can use it in. There's been a lot of studies about ag literacy, which is basically education about agriculture, but none of them have directly referenced this particular theory, and I think that this would be another way that we can further enhance the field of agricultural communications. And yeah, so that's pretty much my thoughts on agriculture communications and the knowledge gap hypothesis. So yeah, those are all my references, and if you have any questions, you can email me. So that pretty much sums up a little bit about the knowledge gap theory, and I hope you enjoyed the presentation.